Bum. wonder if the chat works. Yay, hey Caitlin. The chat works. Hey, hey Caitlin. So there is a pretty significant delay right now, folks. So just be aware of that. Angel and Caitlin, have you done the AP demo yet? Also, folks, if you are here, please just say hi so I know who's here. Caitlin, have you done the AP demo yet? Oh, I got a bit of a delay there, but yes, you know, if you do log in, let me know if you've done the demo, and then just say hi in the chat. We'll try to make this work, even though there's a bit of a delay right now. I'm not sure why it's so significant, but it shouldn't be too much of a big deal. But you will need to be typing into the chat throughout today's review. So the big reason why we want to do the demo is if the technology works there, it should work day of the exam. Roberto Richard, welcome. So I'm going to keep sort of emphasizing that we take a look at this checklist just to make sure that we're not stressed out on related things. I mentioned this a little bit the other day as well. I think the biggest sort of thing we need to keep a lookout for is sort of that before we test. Now remember, we do need to make sure that we're logged in at 12:30 just to do like security checks. We also need to make sure that we sort of prepare not only our resources but our workspace ahead of time. Notably, sort of the Word documents that we plan on using or the actual sort of written pages themselves. So again, the biggest things that you guys need to remember are to make sure that if you're writing by hand, that you have the pages already ready to go. Your API ID and your initials and the page number has to be on every page. If you're using a Word document or like Google Docs, you want to make sure that your API ID is at the top with your initials, and then you're good to go. But those are the big reminders. All right, let's do this. Let's start with 3.1. equals trade. Let's annotate this together now, folks, which means I expect you to drop in some examples in the chat. All right, that is going to be relevant for this key concept. Talking about a deepening and widening of networks of human interaction. Ooh, that's fancy talk for like trade networks, which means that we're going to have the spread of culture, technology, and various crops. That's what they mean by biological diffusion within in between societies. So when we take a look at the key concepts when we're studying, we really just want to provide more supporting information that might elaborate on the various technologies and things that are listed here. So we can provide examples of improved commercial practices. We can provide examples of powerful new trading cities. We can provide examples of new states that are growing along the Indian Ocean. We can provide an example of innovations in previously existing commercial and transportation technologies, etc. We can think about why the economy of Song China is thriving at this time. So let's open it up. Drop some examples in the chat. Yes, well, the fish the that is the compass, Roberto. But I'm glad you remember that it used to be a floating like iron fish, and they would put it in water, and because it was iron, it would point out which direction was north south. Yeah, Swahili city states are a good one. Calicut also good. I'm with you on Tenochtitlan in the Americas. Yeah, Roberto, astrolabe for sure. They do mention that in the key concepts, though. If you notice, what is a caravanserai? Forms of credit such as. Right on there, Angel. Note that they were also in Central Asia, not just Trans-Saharan. Nice with the caravanserai, guys. Caitlin, you got the banking houses. Do we have any states in the Indian Ocean? Oh, hey, Tracy. Down junk. Great. Roberto, I'd say the same thing about the Mongols. I think there's a lot of factors for their growth, but probably not trade related. You know, they were just really badass. Oh, hey, Amersa. When you think Indian Ocean states, you should think South Asia and Southeast Asia. And of course, the Swahili city states. Song Dynasty at the time. Fun fact, the Song Dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate will fall because of the Mongols. Yes, Ayuans, there it is. So there's several states in South Asia too. Just make sure we're aware of that as well. The Delhi Sultanate's one, their Turkish Caliphate. More on them later. Um, Vijayanagar, which I can never pronounce. It's very complicated to spell. Just recognize that in South Asia, the Chola Kingdom, right at the tip of India in the south, these are all trading sort of focused states that are going to be growing in South and Southeast Asia thanks to trade. Some new key concepts here. Um, there's your Mali. We do see the expansion of states in West Africa, which is largely being driven by the Trans Saharan state. Um, and they are then incorporating new people into sort of this regional economy. All right. You also have sort of the intensification of trade because of knowledge of the monsoon winds. You should be able to identify monsoon winds on a map. When it talks about transportation technologies, You should also be thinking about things I think someone brought up earlier, like the camel saddle. Um, Compass and Astrolabe would kind of go in there too, but also like the Latine sail, which is being refined, other things like that. Muslim rule expands. Let's identify some specific states. Who were the Sufis? Why do they matter? Examples of diaspora communities and where? Sorry, Caitlin, just on the Malacca. Yes, Malacca would totally work too. Yes, Taiwan, someone's been studying. Nice, Angel. I'm there for it. Sufis, right on, Caitlin. Sufis really had a lot of success. They were most successful in Central Asia and in South Asia, converting people. Yay, Mamluk Caliphate. Modern day Egypt, North Africa. Islam, remember, was very supportive of trade. Muhammad came from a merchant family. Sharia law outlines specific protections for merchants. All right, so let's take a look at our next set of concepts here. By the way, as we are waiting for my slides to change, I hope we are all aware at this point of the wonderful outside evidence organizer that has been created for you. So, a note about this one, the first sort of bullet point here on this slide mentions increasing number of travelers who wrote about their travels. This would be Zheng He from China. He was sort of a Ming explorer. You got Ibn Battuta throughout Afro-Eurasia. He was a Muslim traveler. You have Marco Polo, Venetian. He chills with Kublai Khan over there in Mongol China. Now, this might not necessarily help us for our exam, but it might be good to know if you come across a source from one of these authors to sort of know their background. They were sort of traveling the world more extensively at this time. Chinese cultural traditions, what are those? By the way, this would be a good DBQ topic prompt. You know, how did trade or cross-cultural interactions change societies during this time? Wouldn't be shocked to see something like that. But remember, we have lots of different people from different backgrounds now interacting with one another. So there's a lot of spread and syncretism going on. Yes, he was a Buddhist. Good old Zhuangzhang. I'm not sure now. He is largely given credit for spreading Buddhism, but technically that was happening in the 7th century. So I'm not sure if he'll show up on your exam, but that's super impressive, Ayuans. Buddhism had 2 different branches. Can we name and describe them? Also, by Chinese cultural tradition, we're really talking about what? So this is a slide where we probably need to review some of our notes or information. Freemanpedia, perhaps? Pathogens? Like what? Nice work, Caitlin. Nice, Angel. Nice job with the Buddhism, folks. I do want to, before we move on, I want us to be aware of just how much Islam spreads. The Dar al Islam is the term for the Islamic world, and it becomes quite expansive. Angel and Caitlin, you guys are right on with Hinduism. So if you look at the lovely Freemanpedia map for this time period, and that weird orange color is basically the boundaries of the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world. Remember that Islam will penetrate portions of southern Spain and Portugal, which sort of explains why those places are able to borrow Islamic technology to help them sort of explore over long distances first in the next time period. But just look at how vast that is. And then you have to assume, too, that there are a lot of Muslims in Southeast Asia as well due to trade and diaspora communities. And so Islam's really going to have a huge influence on a large chunk of the world this time. It's pretty impressive. As far as wrapping up 3.1, we are missing some crucial information. I would like us to maybe drop in the chat anything you remember about Confucianism or Hinduism. Let's see if we can specify some beliefs. Not Four Noble Truths, Caitlin. Confucianism was indeed the dominant cultural tradition, Yuans, that is mentioned there with China. And it did spread, the ideas of Confucianism do spread to neighboring regions. like Korea, Japan, Vietnam. Filial piety, good. What is that? Great, Joanna, on the caste system. Now, what's interesting is Hindu states tended to be less centralized because of the caste system. People knew their place, if you will. Less likely to rebel. Because remember, Hinduism believes in reincarnation. Must perform your dharma on earth. Good job, Ayuans. Right on. Filial piety stressed obedience to authority. But at the same time, it stressed authority figures should be benevolent, nice, worthy of obedience, and well trained. Well trained. Foot binding does become associated with sort of Chinese culture. I wouldn't necessarily associate with Confucianism, but yes, foot binding was pretty terrible. Restricts women dramatically. Becomes popular during the song. We're really just missing one more little detail about Confucianism before I feel like I'm ready to move on. It's related to this idea that they're well trained, that people in leadership should be well trained. So there's something else unique about sort of Confucianism and government in China. Yes, it was, Ayuans. The whole women had to obey men thing, the three obediences. Still, Confucianism, training, government. It's an enduring continuity. Yes, it did, Ayuans, which we can add some detail to that. Because in order to have moral and benevolent governance, you needed to train people. Almost as if people in government had to do something first. Oh man, September does feel like a long time ago now. There it is, yes! Yes, civil service exam. Required by all Chinese bureaucrats in every Chinese dynasty through the Qing. Mongols, of course, are the exception. Nice, Caitlin. Don't forget about our friends the Mongols supporting trade, which is a good segue into our next little topic here. Alrighty, let's move on to 3.2. Okay, if 3.1 is all about trade, 3.2 is really sort of more about states, state building, government. All right, 3.1 all about trade. 3.2 more about government. Obviously, the Mongols are going to dominate a big chunk of this time period as they go on their conquering spree. But there's a lot of other things we should be able to talk about. Let's make sure that we understand some of the continuities and sort of change in Turkish states. A lot of you guys already mentioned those caliphates, Mamluk, all right, Delhi, what was Seljuk, Ottoman equals Turkish caliphates. Continuities. The jizya, still an important tax. Innovation equals more medical knowledge, all right, math, science, etc. All right, Muslim world really valued education. We talked about the Song Dynasty and their imperial bureaucracy. I'm glad we did that. So let's not remember, we must remember the whole concept of civil service exam, trained bureaucrats in China. That is something that sort of defines the Song Dynasty and other dynasties. We kind of talked about Khmer already. Oh, feudalism. Let's describe that. does say Europe was politically fragmented. But yes, let's make sure we understand feudalism. I hope we're looking up feudalism right now. Yeah, so nobles could afford protection, i.e., paying knights. Serfs worked their land for food and safety. Serfs were somewhat coerced, though, Caitlin. But nice work there, Caitlin, indeed. So let's remember, like, Europe in 1200 to 1450 is technically still like what historians sometimes call the Dark Ages. So dark, the Mongols found nothing they wanted to conquer. So I think 3.3 you'll notice is pretty short. Like I think the big takeaways with 3.3 are, I would definitely think about, what kind of goods were in high demand in trade networks. We're still talking about luxury goods, textiles equals cotton, clothing, and silk. Porcelain, you can look that up in porcelain's like fine, I guess, like vases and cookware and stuff. I'll just look up Chinese porcelain. It's very big in China. Yes, Caitlin. Europe was pretty isolated at the time. Only really the Italian city-states are doing a lot of trading. I think you guys probably want for 3.32 to think about maybe 2 to 3 cities on the rise, so to speak. 2 to 3 that fell. Mongols destroyed Baghdad, for example. Free peasant agriculture in China. Fun fact, serfdom exists in Europe and Japan at the time. Oh, good one, Caitlin. Yeah, it was one of the few that they could actually take in Southeast Asia. Mongols will try and fail to conquer Japan. All right. Let's talk period 4. Yes, Ions, the Abbasid Caliphate's a great example of a falling state. The Mongols, of course, conquer them. Black Death will also hurt cities too. Freemanpedia has a great organizer for cities. Check it out. So I kind of hope the essay comes from period 4, but last year's essay came from period 4. This year's practice question came from period 5. And so, like, I actually do think that 1200 to 1450, the information we just reviewed really quickly, might be a possible, exam question. But there's a lot going on in 1450 to 1750 that might be tested as well. Land-based empires like the Ottomans are growing. Russia is starting to sort of emerge. The empire, the Russian Empire. The Mughal Empire is growing pretty significantly up until 1700 when Aurangzeb decides to mess with the Marathas. That was a mistake. But our traditional gunpowder empires are sort of a must-know. They are growing dramatically. They are land-based empires. All right, empires like the Qing, Mughal, and Ottoman. So again, the major developments are on this slide, but I would like to go through the key concepts the same way we just did and see if we can annotate key concepts for period 4. We probably won't have time to get through period 5. I have to head out at about 4 o'clock. So I would encourage you to continue to go through the key concepts on your own. And I would also encourage you to continue to go through my outside evidence organizer, which I think is pretty awesome. Some people still have not looked at it, believe it or not. Someone should put a message in the group chat. Be like, hey, if you're one of those people who haven't opened the outside organizer yet, like, shame on you. But, let's knock out some key concepts. So let's start with 4.1. 4.1 is all about the connection between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. The world is going to become connected now because of Europeans voyaging across the ocean, transoceanic, all right, which is going to transform trade, and it's going to have some significant social impacts on the world. Something about how, this new transoceanic connections, how it changed the world, might be a decent prompt. So you'll notice that the first key concept there is talking about knowledge that is spreading from the Islamic and Asian worlds and facilitating European technology developments and innovation. Basically, right, the Europeans are learning about things that other people knew about a long time ago. They're learning about global wind patterns. They are learning about new tools, right? New technologies like the astrolabe and the compass. They are coming up with new ship designs. Things like the caravel and the carrack. Later on, galleons. I forget how to spell the Dutch one. I think it's something like flute. I don't know. Someone look that up. We didn't study the Dutch, but the Dutch will establish a pretty big presence in Southeast Asia. Now, it also says state-supported transoceanic exploration. Now, that means it was supported by the government. Remember that the King and Queen of Spain are actually going to pay for Columbus's voyages. And of course, once Columbus finds the Americas, it's sort of like a competition between European states to find new routes to Asia. Remember that Europe wants in on one thing. The trade in the Indian Ocean. Spice trade. That's what the Europeans are after. All right. And so the Portuguese are really first. Portuguese get a head start. They had more contact with Muslims. Henry the Navigator sets up a school. They start exploring the coast of Africa. Set up trading post. Hopefully we did the essay on that. And then, the English and the French and the Dutch are also going to try to find, a northern passage to Asia. They will fail, But the English and French are going to find Canada and North America, and they're going to set up colonies there, like the United States. Good times. And one thing that will help European states sort of establish a presence in new regions was the concept of a joint stock company. Examples? Good examples, Angel. Can we describe joint stock companies? Can we define mercantilism? So you're getting there, Caitlin, on the whole idea of a monopoly. The key concepts talk about it. Chartered European monopoly companies equals joint stock companies. Right on Hell. Right on. Well, you're on the right track, Ions. Let's make sure we got the key parts of mercantilism, though. Export more than you import. Store precious metals, which can fund your military. Yes, the connection to the caravan is a good one, Angel. boom. Now, yeah, it wants for sure. They want to get the raw materials so that they can make something and then export it. Or they just want silver. You can see in this key concept, like the silver is really driving global trade. And Spain, you know, they benefited for a long time because Spain, you know, had most of the silver initially. Colonies in Americas is where they found the silver. Now, I do want to say one thing about the cultural synthesis. Kind of equals syncretism. It talks about how the Atlantic Exchange, the Atlantic trading system, included enslaved persons, which mixed African American and European cultures. I would just think about Vodun and Santeria. They're syncretic religions in the Caribbean. Mix of Christianity, African religions, some indigenous. But we did an essay on this, so I'm not going to spend too much on it. I'm also not going to spend too much time on the Columbian Exchange, although, I mean, I think it's unlikely we get a DBQ on the Columbian Exchange, although that would be, like, amazing. So when we think about the Columbian Exchange, let's just think about the effects of the Columbian Exchange. Now, one, we need to make sure Columbian Exchange is not a trade route. Simply describes the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between Old World Afro-Eurasia and New World Americas. So let's specify effects on Americas, and then specify effects on Europe, Africa, and other regions. Oh, come on now. Yes, that is called what, Angel? Sometimes known as? Yes, good, Ayuans. In fact, American crops will become staples, as in like important, in Europe, Asia, and Africa. One easy example would be my favorite because I'm Irish. Yes, Angel. Death of natives, known as Great Dying sometimes. Yeah, tobacco becomes super popular. Sugar is an old world crop that goes to Americas. Fuels, plantation labor there. Horses from old world to new. Pigs. Pigs may have carried a whole lot of disease. Now, please note that it mentions that populations in Afro-Eurasia benefit from new diversity equals population growth. In fact, one could argue this growth was necessary for industrialization. Indeed, Caitlin. Alrighty, folks, I'm going to do a little narration for a bit just to speed us along here. Hope we're not too offended. But going along with this theme of 4.1 being like the new world being connected in more ways than ever, we are going to see an increase in intensification of interactions between different hemispheres, which means that, we're going to start to see some religious conflict and, some syncretism in places. So one thing to note is the Protestant Reformation starts in Europe. And the Protestant Reformation is a big deal. Groups of people, Martin Luther is a good example. He starts the whole Lutheran religion. Sort of, they break away from the Catholic Church. They basically start their own Christian churches. And the Catholic Church really freaked out about this. They tried to reform their own church. In Spain, they had something called the Inquisition, where they basically tried to force everyone to be Catholic. They killed you if you weren't. That was pretty bad. But in many ways, it's going to lead to these different churches sort of competing with one another, and that's going to lead to a whole lot of growth of Christianity in the Americas. So, you know, Spain and Portugal, of course, were Catholic. France was mostly Catholic, but Britain tends to be, the British were mostly Protestant. They will, you know, convert indigenous in North America and Southeast Asia to Christianity. I don't think we're going to see a mention of political rivalries, but you did have a rivalry in the Middle East between the Ottomans and the Safavid empires. The Safavid were another gunpowder empire in Central Asia, and they had a big falling out over which branch of Islam to follow, Sunni or Shia. This would be a surprising DBQ topic because it's so specific, but you might want to go in AMSCO and look up information on that. Remember that in the Mughal Empire, we have Akbar the Great. So he's going to lead to a lot of like more friendly interactions between Hindus and Muslims, and because of those interactions, you're going to see a new religion emerge known as Sikhism. Now, it's influenced heavily by Hindu and Islam. Now, of course, Aurangzeb will ruin that, and the Mughal Empire, but that's a different story. I have numerous examples of syncretism in the in your outside organizer tracker. So definitely make sure that you're taking a look at that. So 4.2. 4.2 is really going to be more about labor and the economy and social structures, because in this time period, you know, the work that you did was very much related to your social status. Although in the Americas, there also becomes to be a racial component, yeah. So the demand for labor is really going to intensify because of mercantilism. Their need for raw materials is growing in Europe. Europe's more involved in trade. And so you're going to see a huge expansion of plantation agriculture and the Atlantic slave trade. Now, you still had small peasants in Europe who had like farms, and you had artisans who were like skilled people, and they still did work. And in many parts of Europe, this labor intensified. I would say both in East Asia and China, and in Europe, you did have an intensification of like peasant labor and like this artisan craftsmanship. Enslavement is going to obviously increase in the Americas, but you know, slavery wasn't necessarily new. You know, the concept of slavery existed in Africa previously. Typically, you know, slaves were like a household might have one or two slaves to help out as servants. Or those slaves would be sent to the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean to do sugar cultivation. Now, this was something that the Muslims did in Africa in the previous time period. And so notice that in your key concept for 4.2, it says that it continues, and it does. But the Europeans are going to sort of borrow this idea of using African slaves for sugar plantations. And, you know, after the indigenous die, they're going to have a whole lot of African men imported to the Americas, mostly to the Caribbean and Latin America. That's where most of the sugar plantations were, and so that's where most of the slaves end up. Now, because most of the slaves were men, you do get a gender imbalance in Africa, which meant that women had to take on new roles, and also meant that the practice of polygamy increased, where, you know, women basically, you know, or men had multiple wives because there just weren't a lot of men around. You'll also, of course, going to see a lot more African people in the Americas, which is going to lead to more mixing of races, known as the Mestizo Society. Now, the American economy, again, is going to be largely dependent on agriculture, the growth of sugar or the growth of tobacco, and the extraction of silver. So, like, silver, sugar, tobacco are really the main drivers of American economy. You can maybe put furs up there if we're talking about North America. And so the Europeans are going to use all sorts of labor systems. You know, they're going to try encomiendas first. But that doesn't really work because, you know, a lot of the Spaniards were mean. And so then they try to adopt the Mita system where they allow the indigenous to live independently. And remember we talked about the República de Indios? Independent indigenous communities, but they had to do like corvée labor. Remember, temporary forced labor. Spaniards will adopt the Mita system, which the Mita was what the Incans used. They would have, you know, men would do like a month of service, usually doing public projects. The Spanish will basically require the indigenous to send a few people to work in silver mines. Eventually, you're going to see chattel slavery. This is the slavery we talk about when we talk about slavery in the United States or in the Americas. Human beings were bought and sold as property. It was for their lifetime. Their children would inherit slavery status. That's what we mean by chattel slavery. Indentured servitude was for poor Europeans at this time. They would do a lot of different work. Sometimes they would work on like tobacco plantations in North America, or they would work as like private servants. But if you were a poor European and you wanted to start a new life in the Americas but couldn't afford to go, you could sign an indentured contract. I want to emphasize that these are Europeans from 1450 to 1750 because that's going to change in the next time period. All right. That will be an important change to keep note of. But, you know, I think for us, that's really what we need to keep track of when we talk about this time period in the Americas. It's just like, you know, because of the plantations and the need to extract silver and grow tobacco and grow sugar, you just see a whole lot of forced labor at this time. Now, that's also going to mean that, you know, there's going to be some restructuring of hierarchies. Now, obviously, race-based hierarchy becomes new. Remember, the Spaniards would have those Castas paintings. You know, Creoles were at the top. Those are pure-blooded Europeans. But, you know, you're going to see, because of like the global trade opportunities, you are going to see economic elites. And by, you know, new political and economic elites, we really mean like there's this new merchant class that is gaining more and more money. And in the Americas, you're going to have the new political elite, the Creoles, and they're the elites because of the Casta system, because they're white. And so in the Americas, you know, the new political elite are basically anyone with European blood. The Qing dynasty is interesting. Now remember that the Qing dynasty were founded by Manchus, ethnic group from the north. All right, they will dominate China, all right, during this time period. Beginning in the 17th century. I want to emphasize that, not the entire time period. Remember that they forbade intermarriage. Men had to wear the traditional Manchu style. Now, I believe that was called the Q. I need to find out how to spell that. CUE works. So it was the Q. Remember they shaved everything? They had the long ponytail. You do see, existing elites have their power, fluctuate a little bit. And by existing elites, think about the European nobles will lose some status. Kings don't need them anymore. In terms of gender and family restructuring, think about the fact that if you're a merchant family, your family size is going to start to decrease, so fewer children, because children were primarily used for agricultural labor, and obviously we don't need that as much anymore. Women in, some parts of the world are going to see increasing status. That would be women in Southeast Asia because of trading partnerships with Europeans, or women in Africa because they could take on new economic roles. Women in China got a little bit better roles as well because the Qing, remember, were Manchu, they were foreigners, and so they were not as, they placed a low emphasis on the foot binding. And so, those are some things you might want to take note of for this particular key concept. All right, so 4.1 and 4.2 are largely about trade and social structures and culture. 4.3 is really the big, political key concept, where, basically we're talking about politics. Empires are going to continue to grow, both land-based and, of course, maritime empires. That would be the European. And rulers will continue to use religious ideas, art, and monumental architecture to legitimize their rule. This would actually be a pretty good DBQ prompt, in my opinion, if they talked about the various ways empires have, legitimized their rule throughout history. Remember, that's like what gives them the right to be in charge. So we have the divine right of kings in Europe. You have the Ottoman miniature paintings. You have monumental architecture like the Taj Mahal in India, the Blue Mosque in Ottoman. You could even argue that the Costas paintings, now they weren't really used by rulers, but they were used to reinforce hierarchy. Oh, the Palace of Versailles, I forgot about that one. That's a good one. Remember Louis XIV? He had the flowing hair. And it talks about the Mughal and the Ottoman empires adopting practices to accommodate the ethnic and religious diversity of their subjects, and to utilize the contributions of different groups. Now, remember that the Ottoman had the Devshirme, Christian slaves. But, they were trained as bureaucrats or to be elite soldiers. Do you remember the name of that elite soldier group, guys? Military professionals, if you will. It's part of what made the Ottomans so successful. Janissary. I forgot that on the outside evidence, man. I'm so sad. Janissaries. So like that was a pretty interesting way that the Ottomans incorporated non-Muslims to get them to contribute militarily. The Mughal, of course, were very accommodating, very tolerant. But it does say that in other cases, states suppressed diversity or limited certain groups' roles. You can think about the Mughal under Aurangzeb when he started to persecute the Hindus and didn't let them serve in government and you know put down temples. Remember that the Manchus in China will also limit the role of non-Manchus, so they were not very tolerant there. Of course, the Europeans were pretty non-tolerant of all indigenous and refused to allow them to have big roles in the economy or politics, basically forcing them to be laborers. But again, military professionals like the Janissaries was common amongst all states. Remember, the Europeans would start to have professional armies from all that money from the Americas, and so the kings were gaining power there. We of course have tribute systems will continue. Both the Aztecs and the Qing dynasty will use a tribute system to collect taxes. And of course, it mentions that imperial expansion is going to rely on gunpowder and cannons. The Europeans, of course, will use this, but also the gunpowder empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Mughal, all will use gunpowder to expand. 4.3, I think, again, would be an interesting set of key concepts to do a DBQ on. So definitely spend some time on 4.3. There's one last key concept I want to highlight before I have to sign off today. So I'm going to skip ahead. I should have 5.4 here somewhere, I hope. Oh, no, I don't. Uh-oh. Well, I don't have 5.4, I'm afraid, guys. All right, but key concept 5.4 covers migration patterns in the period 1750 to 1900. So, I recommend that you definitely review key concepts for period 5. I know they gave us the practice prompt from that time period, but like I really wouldn't be surprised if we see, something from that time period. That wouldn't shock me. That wouldn't shock me. So before I sign off, I'm on a bit of a lag here, so I'm going to stick around for a little bit of while. But if you guys have any questions about like the exam, what it's going to look like, are you freaking out for whatever reason, let me know before I go. Final questions. I will stick around tomorrow at like noon for like I'll be live around noon just as a final send-off or to help you guys with tech issues. But do we have any questions, concerns, anything like that right now? bum, bum. Well, if there's no questions, folks, again, I would spend some time with 1750 to 1900. It's the one part that we didn't get a chance to review here. Other than that, you have some questions you'll have to fill in, Caitlin, for there will be some questions. But, you know, I'm not sure what that form looks like because I haven't had the chance to take the exam. But it's just like basic questions like name, etc., APID, that kind of stuff. Key concept 3.1 through 3.3 for sure because they're so old. But I like... But I mean, I would kind of focus on all your key concepts at this point. I would also study my outside organizer tracker. It's just like you're just your internet browser, Caitlin. If the same way you did the demo, it's going to be the exact same. Also, can we emphasize the master cheat sheet in the group chat? I notice some of your classmates haven't actually seen it. Any final questions, folks? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Yay. All right, Caitlin. Well, thank you guys for coming. And just simplify. My final advice is just to simplify your studying at this point. You know, key concepts, vocabulary. You know, maybe take a look at old DBQs and just sort of simplify your life. Cheat sheet, key concepts, old DBQ feedback. I think the old DBQ feedback will be pretty good, you know, especially regarding sourcing. So